Bob Marley is among the most iconic musicians in the world, with 150 million in album sales. Marley's mission of love and peace was born from the tiny island of Jamaica, but inspired the entire world. And Lee Jaffe caught it all.
I was doing something that, for me, I thought was the most important thing I could possibly be doing with my life. As an artist, kind of collaborator, part of the art is getting the art out there.
Lee Jaffe, one of the world's most important photographers, lived with Bob Marley at 56 Hope Road in Kingston for 3 years. That's right, they were roommates for 3 years. And during that time, Lee fostered a rich and meaningful personal relationship with Bob.
Bob was like so charismatic and so fun to be around. You just wanted to be around him.
Lee joins me on this episode of Some Future Day and shares who Bob Marley was as a person, as a human. We closely examine Bob's motivation and drive to succeed on the global stage. Lee, thank you for joining me on this awesome episode of Some Future Day. Lee Jaffe, my friend and the master photographer who's done so much work, including his most recent book, Hit Me With Music, which just came out and was published by Rizzoli. Lee, it's such a pleasure to have you on Some Future Day. How are you today?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
Lee, I'm doing great. It's such a thrill to have you on my show today. As you know, I'm a big fan, but I also love your stories. And I don't think you've had a real opportunity to flush these amazing stories out. Today, we're going to focus on the new book and Jamaica, with obviously Bob Marley as the central theme. But let's start with you. Let's get into the Lee Jaffe world. I loved when you were talking about your background in education. I know you were a college dropout, but before you dropped out, you were at Penn State. And in the book, you described yourself as a double major in art and LSD. So I thought that was pretty cool. I haven't met a lot of people that double majored in art and LSD. How did that go at Penn State? What was going on? Like, what years was it? What year were you in Penn State? And what was going on in the world that you were experimenting with psychedelics?
Let's see. I started, by the way, I was a college dropout, but I'm also a college graduate.
Ah, I didn't know that.
I started college really young. I rushed through junior high and high school. And I was 16 when I started college.
Oh, wow.
In 1964. And it was right at the beginning of psychedelics, or people knowing about psychedelics. And when I arrived at Penn State, it was like 30,000, 25,000 students. 7 smoked pot. And when I dropped out, I dropped out twice. I dropped out after my freshman year and went hitchhiking. And then I heard that there was going to be this really good art professor coming to teach. So I was going to go to India. A lot of Hindus were going to India at that time. Dropping out and going to India. And I thought, well, okay, I'll go back to college and see what this professor was like. And his name was Italo Skanga, and he really influenced me in becoming an artist. And I started to I'd go to New York on the weekends, and then I started to bring back, they called it marijuana in those days, and hash. And then when psychedelics started, I would start to bring back whatever the newest thing was, mescaline and the LSD. And I kind of turning on the school. The second time I dropped out, before my senior year, probably 10,000 people were smoking pot. So I was part of the movement to legalize cannabis before I ever moved to Jamaica. When I entered school, I was the youngest student on campus. And when I graduated in 2008, I was the oldest.
That's amazing. That's an amazing story. So you went from, you started in 1964, but then finally in 2008, you finished your undergrad years.
Yeah, I had a year to go, like 30 credits or something. I thought I had like a 3.3 average, but when I looked at my transcript, I actually had a 2.3.
Too much LSD. Do you think that undergrad education, like academia, formal academia training today, is important?
Well, it was crucial for me. I think it all depends if you have good teachers. You know, I had this incredible teacher, and I had a really good, my freshman English teacher, who was a PhD student at the time. She was really encouraging because I was really, when I entered school, I was really serious about writing poetry. And she was really encouraging. And amazingly, when we were working on the Basquiat book, she had contacted me just like on social media. I hadn't been in touch with her in 50 years. And I really wanted to find her, but I couldn't remember her last name. And then she pinged me, and she was still teaching. And wow. She wound up helping me to edit the texts for both the Basquiat book and the new book. It was kind of amazing.
So in between that time period of starting at Penn State and then graduating at Penn State, you spent 3 years living at 56 Hope Road in Kingston, Jamaica.
Well,
right?
I had some other amazing experiences before that. So when I dropped out of school the second time, I moved to Brazil. And I wound up staying in the house of an artist called Elio Wojciechowska. And his house at that time in Rio was the cultural center of Brazil. And Elio, since his untimely death in 1980 at the age of 44, subsequently, I would say you can make a strong argument that he's the most influential artist of the last 60 years, because he's really the person who pretty much invented installation art. And that's what art is now.
I agree with you. I think immersive artwork continues to grow, and it's interesting from my perspective because now you're seeing immersive artwork both physically and digitally, which is pretty wild. And it should be interesting to see how immersive digital artwork continues to grow with the advent of new technologies like spatial computing. I think the world is going to look very different in years to come because you and I might be walking down the street in Soho, New York City, and all of a sudden we'll be surrounded by your photographs, you know?
Yeah, which makes me think of when I first became aware of Jean-Michel's work. It was from, he and Al Diaz were writing the Samo things, with poetry on the walls of streets in Soho. But to get back to Elio, my Brazilian experience is really what allowed me to integrate into the culture in Brazil. So when I moved to Brazil in 1969, there was a military government that had pretty much instated by the CIA in 1964, and it was tremendously repressive. The term disappeared, became a verb. People on the left disappeared college professors. When I arrived, the great musicians Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil had been in prison for 6 months. And when I arrived in Brazil, they were in exile. They were told, you're going to stay in prison or you're going to leave the country. And they were living in England. And Elio's house had become the center, the cultural center. People every day would be arriving, and musicians. I would be jamming with Michael and Nana Vasconcelos, the great percussionist. It was my first introduction to the instrument, the berimbau. And then the great movie makers, Navili Dalmeida, Rogério Scanzella, Miguel Rio Branco. I became involved in all this culture, and all these friends and people around Elio, and a movement that was called Tropicalia, which was named after an installation that Elio did at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio in 1967, which was this installation piece. And it involved a live parrot. It was an incredible breakthrough of the idea of art. And it also, living there and meeting all these artists and filmmakers, made me very aware of the neo-colonialist cultural kind of elimination of what new art was about. Because in my education, my art education, that, for instance, minimal art, I was sure was invented in the 60s in New York. And when I arrived in Brazil, Elio made me aware that there was this group of artists in Rio called the Group of Frenchy, which Elio was a part of, that were making minimal art in 1954 and 1955. So, where was that in my art history knowledge? So, and then I got used to living amongst these people that were creating art, movies, literature, opposing the fascist military regime. And all my friends were in constant danger. And I was just picked up off the street one day and thrown in prison. And spent a couple of horrifying weeks. I didn't know. You don't know what's going to happen. You might disappear.
So Lee, you were imprisoned by the government in Brazil?
Yeah, I was just picked up off the street.
And then how long were you in prison exactly? Like more than 2 weeks?
No, about 2 weeks.
And then what were you arrested for? I didn't even realize this.
No, they don't say why you were arrested. But I was arrested because of the people I was hanging out with, who were all opposing the government.
Mm-hmm.
And then we left. I left. I had to leave. Elio Ortesica, myself, Miguel Rio Branco, we went to New York. And then my other friends, my movie maker friends, Navili Dalmeida, his crew, small film crew, they went to England. Rogério Scanzella, the great director, and his wife, great actress Elena Inez, They went to Paris. We were all refugees. I mean, I became a refugee in my home country, a refugee from Brazil,
Right.
basically. But this experience of living under this kind of tension, being in Jamaica, I wasn't afraid because there was a lot of political violence going on at the time I moved to Jamaica.
So let's talk about that for a second. I think it's an interesting segue to Jamaica. So as I had mentioned, you lived with Bob Marley personally for 3 years, and something that's very interesting to me about Bob Marley's music is that the lyrics really tap into that human strife. It is very political. It is very tense at times. What was Jamaica like when you arrived in Jamaica? What was the government like? I think there were like some kind of connection with Cuba that was trying to be developed. What was it like on the ground? What was the general atmosphere?
Well, there was a socialist prime minister who embraced the Rasta culture and who had his name was Michael Manley, and he had a vision of Jamaica being a self-sustaining agrarian economy, very much aligned with Rasta philosophy. And the Wailers, when Michael Manley was running for prime minister in the early 70s, the Wailers had supported him. At that time, the Wailers were Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and Bunny Livingston. So they were very much in support of this socialist government at the time. And of course, the other side was being supported by the CIA, and there was a lot of fear with Michael Manley had become friends with Castro, and Cuba was sending engineers to help build bridges and infrastructure. And Cuba's only the north coast of Jamaica and the south coast of Cuba. It's only 50 miles apart. So there was this fear in the U.S. that the government in Jamaica might start nationalizing, for instance, the aluminum mining.
Right, because I believe bauxite is an ingredient in aluminum, and it's a massive natural resource in Jamaica, right? Bauxite.
Yeah. And right at that time in 1973, the CIA was fomenting a coup in Chile, and Salvador Allende was assassinated, the socialist prime minister. So there was this global tension. South America, and of course in Jamaica, and Jamaica being so close not only to Cuba but to the U.S. So there was this great tension when I arrived there, but I was used to it from being in Brazil, from being in prison in Brazil, for living and working with friends and colleagues, Brazilian friends and colleagues, who were living under that pressure from 1964 until the time I arrived in Brazil in 69. So it prepared me for my life in Jamaica.
So, Lee, I want to ask you, like, what is it that the government, or maybe even plural, like generally speaking, why are governments fearful of the creative class? Like, you lived amongst creatives, it seems like best in class, real visionaries, groundbreaking people in Brazil, and then you move over to Jamaica. It's an incredible story, actually, how it wasn't like you just knocked on Bob Marley's door and ended up living with him. Obviously, you lived with him for 3 years, but that was also a big creative group of people living together, working together as well. Why do governments fear the creative class?
Well, I don't know that all governments fear the creative class, But at that time, in Jamaica and Brazil, the creative class were creating things opposing the government. And the creative class, especially, popular music, the Wailers were the voice of the people. So people related to it.
But you also mentioned the fact that the government brought a Rastafarian pillar into the community. Maybe take a second and explain what what it means to be
The government in
Rastafarian.
Jamaica, when I arrived, they had a socialist prime minister. It was the opposing party that feared the Rasta culture. Dreadlocks, the term dreadlocks came from the upper classes of Jamaica fearing the Rasta culture. So the Rastas, part of the culture was not to comb your hair. It was a sign that you were not part of the neo-colonialist reigning system. The upper class people started to call it dread because it was dreadful to look at. The Rastas were dreadful to look at. The Rastas embraced the term dreadlocks and they started calling themselves the Dreads. So that's kind of where that came from.
So let's go back a little bit because it's a remarkable, cool story too. I know, before you met Bob Marley, you're back in New York City and you're with the legendary Jim Capaldi from Traffic, incredibly talented artist, musician, a real, in many ways, a futuristic type of artist. And I understand that that's the first time you encountered Bob Marley before you moved to Jamaica. It's such an interesting story to me. Can you walk through that for a second?
I had become friends with Jim through meeting a Jamaican actress who was living in London called Esther Anderson. And I had become friends with Jim, and his group Traffic was playing some shows in New York. At the time, they were a hugely popular group selling out arenas around the world. And after one of his shows in New York, I went to visit him at his hotel. And this is just Jamaican guy there. And they had a cassette of his new album. The guy was Bob Marley. And the new album was the first album that his group, the Wailers, recorded for Island Records. It was still hadn't been released yet. And when they put it on the boombox, I was just kind of blown away how amazing it was. It felt like this could be something that would have a tremendous cultural, political, and social impact for a couple of reasons. For instance, Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil, as great as they were and as important as they were in Brazil, they were singing in a foreign language. They were singing in Portuguese, and it's not a language that a lot of people are fluent in.
Admittedly and embarrassingly, I love Caetano Veloso's music, and I don't understand that. I didn't realize that it had this revolutionary undertone that you're describing.
Well, yeah, they were like the Bob Dylan of Brazil.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful music.
You might say Caetano was like the Bob Dylan, and Gil was like the Marvin Gaye. Kind of.
Incredible.
Here were these Jamaican guys, they singing in English, and I knew they had like the perfect record company, which was owned by and started by a Jamaican, Chris Blackwell. And was on the one hand producing, distributing music that was greatly popular. Traffic, Joe Cocker, Cat Stevens was selling millions of records. And they were also putting out records, critically acclaimed artists that wouldn't necessarily have a lot of commercial appeal, like Nick Drake and Sandy Denny, John Martin. And they were supporting those artists by being able to also have success, commercial success with these other artists. I mean, for me at that time, Island Records was a very unique record company in that regard. And I felt, well, because they were on this record label, that this music really, as innovative as it was, had a chance to really reach a huge audience.
I understand that the relationship that began between Bob Marley and Blackwell was really interesting. At the time, Blackwell loaned them the equivalent of like £4,000 UK at the time. And people assumed that Marley and the Wailers took advantage of him. But in fact, it was the opposite. They felt really they need to do the right thing. And there was like no contract. There was no written contract. It was a handshake type of a deal. And Blackwell was like trustful and obviously rightfully so. Apparently Marley and the Wailers went into the studio and worked hard for like many, many days and created some of the best music ever. It's interesting how the world has changed, because I don't think today either the record producer or the record production company or the artist would ever do anything like that on a handshake. Different world.
Well, Chris told me the story of how he came to sign the Wailers. He had been involved in producing the movie The Harder They Come.
Yeah.
Directed by a Jamaican, Perry Hensel. It starred Jimmy Cliff, who was on Island Records. And Island helped to finance the movie because they saw it as a star vehicle for Jimmy Cliff. And Island Records had started before they had commercial success. It started with Chris licensing Jamaican singles for distribution in the UK. And then he had this huge pop hit with a 15-year-old Jamaican, Millie Small. And that sort of pushed them into this pop world.
Yeah, I think that Millie Small record I read that it sold 6 million copies, huh? It's crazy.
That was a number one worldwide hit.
Yeah.
And then Island was off and running. But at the time, Chris explained to me that when he wanted to find a bigger audience for Jamaican music. And at the time, when he signed Jimmy Cliff, he felt that Island needed to focus on breaking one artist and didn't have the resources to promote more than one artist and get them into the huge kind of marketplace. And the production of the movie The Harder They Come had dragged on a lot longer than they thought it was going to. And Jimmy Cliff's contract was coming up with Island. And Chris had assumed that he was going to re-sign him because the movie was nearing completion. And Jimmy Cliff turned around and signed with A&M.
Huh.
And Chris explained to me that the week that happened, he got a call from somebody saying that the Wailers were in London and would he take a meeting with them? And he told me that if Jimmy Cliff hadn't left the label that week, he wouldn't have taken the meeting. And he told me that when they walked into his office, that the three of them, they were so charismatic that he just said to them, what do you need to make an album? And he told them a sum of money, and he just gave it to them. And he told me his staff thought, oh, you're never going to see the money.
Right.
Rasta guys, blah, blah, blah. And that's how the first album, Catch a Fire, came about. And then I got to hear it before it was released. And I just knew it was going to be that that this was an incredible work of art and had this tremendous social political importance. And they had the right record label. And I just knew this was going to be the biggest thing.
So, Lee, I want to ask you, like, you talk about a certain level of integrity that the Wailers had. And if you look at the lyrics from No Woman, No Cry, good friends we have, good friends we have lost along the way. In this great future, you can't forget your past. So dry your tears, I say. I'm curious, like, do those lyrics kind of embody who Bob Marley, the person, was? I could read I know you know them. I could read them again if you'd like, but I'm curious, what was he like? I know in your book, you talk about Bob Marley at times being ironic. The story you just told really shows a ton of integrity. What was he like individually?
Well, he was funny. He was incredibly charismatic, entertaining to be around. I mean, for me, I played harmonica. He played guitar. He wrote his songs on acoustic guitar. And he was writing all the time. Every day he was creating new songs or working on new songs. Because some of those songs, they might seem simple, but they're very crafted. And some of them he worked on days, weeks, back and forth.
So I know this when you talk about playing harmonica with him, it's incredible. When I first met you, I was like so excited to hear that you specifically played harmonica on Rebel Music. But something else that you did with him, which I think is super amazing, is it fair to say to a certain extent you co-wrote or inspired I Shot the Sheriff?
I have one line in the song.
So how did that just for the viewers, talk about how it unfolded
as he was creating them.
Where were you guys?
We're on a beat.
Tell that story.
And he just came out with I Shot the Sheriff, and I said, well, you didn't get the deputy. There's no sheriffs in Jamaica. So that's why I came out with, but you didn't get the deputy because there's no sheriffs in Jamaica. But it was very catchy, and he started to write the song, and I thought, well, this could be a song that's going to be a big pop hit for you. And Catch a Fire album didn't sell anything, so I knew he was going to have to eventually have a song that maybe could break through on radio, which was, especially in the U.S., was a tremendously uphill battle to get on radio. But I wrote down the lyrics because I didn't want him to forget them.
You're being very humble today, but the truth is that you had a lot to do with creating one of the most iconic songs across all music genres in history. I Shot the Sheriff.
Well, I wrote the lyrics down. I was there. I don't think he probably wouldn't have forgotten them anyway. But, yeah. I mean, I was there, all the time that I spent with him and the time I spent with Peter making the Legalize It album, I felt like it was a great privilege just to be around these guys. And, when I started to work with them, my first job with them, my job was to organize a North American tour. Chris offered me that job because at that time Island didn't have a staff in the U.S. They had a big organization in the U.K., but in the U.S. they were licensing all the records to Capitol Records. So they only had one guy working for Island Records in the U.S. So he asked me if I'd be interested to help organize a North American tour. And I just wanted to help get the music out because I thought it was the most important thing that I could be doing in the world at that time.
Yeah, I know the words in your book really show how much you cared about Bob Marley, the Wailers, the family. It showed how much you cared about helping get the music out and getting to that level of success.
It was more about him caring about me. Bob and Rita, they were taking care of me.
Yeah.
I didn't have any money. I had a couple of changes of clothes. Eventually, I was wearing all Bob's clothes. And
in Jamaica?
When I was living in Jamaica for 3 years.
That's amazing.
I was living at Hope Road with Bob.
Mm-hmm.
There was the rehearsal studio there. It was the Wailers Center. But also be staying, out with Rita and the kids, sleeping on the floor on the porch, waking up in the morning, and Rita would make porridge for the kids, and there'd be a bowl of porridge for me. They took care of me.
It's so nice.
And I was doing something that, for me, I thought it was the most important thing I could possibly be doing with my life. As an artist, a kind of collaborator.
For sure.
Part of the art is getting the art out there. And that's what needed to be done then. And I was able to help. And I thought of it as a privilege and exciting. It was tough times because there was no money. But for me, I didn't have any kids at that time. I wasn't married. But for Bob, Peter, Bunny, especially Bob, he had several little kids. And Rita taking care of the kids, physically building this little house for them when they moved out from Trenchtown, running a record label, singing with a singing group. And Bob had a little bit of money coming from publishing because he had 2 songs on a Johnny Nash album that sold a lot of copies. So he had a little bit of money coming in every 4 months. But a lot of people depending on him besides his family. His group, which the Catch a Fire didn't sell, and then the second Island album didn't sell, Burnin'. It was a lot of pressure. And then the pressure of being the voice of the people. Being the voice of the sufferers.
I understand that he was like a very kind-hearted person. You talk about his children. I understand that he was a kind-hearted and very funny person as it related to his children too. Years ago, I heard this story that you might have heard about it if I heard about it, where he would like race his children on the beach, and he would never let them win. He would beat them every time. He would run as hard as he could. It actually inspired me to beat my kids on the beach. I don't know if you ever heard that, Lee.
Kevin MacDonald directed this great documentary, Marley, And I think it's Bob's daughter, Sedella, talks about that.
How's that? Right?
Yeah, Bob was very competitive. He was a really good soccer, football player. It was an integral part of his life.
Yeah, I heard when he came and finally made it to touring big time in the United States, he wanted to actually build football fields in these major stadiums across the United States so he could play during the day and he could say that he played in every football stadium and then he performed. But going back before you mentioned like organizing the tour. I know something that you like a major accomplishment for you. This is like to me like the opening scene of the Lee Jaffe Bob Marley movie where, you're in New York City. You want to get these guys back, up front and center on tour in the United States. And you want to get them known. And you decide you're going to go to one of the hottest places in New York City in 1973, Max's Kansas City. And you're a young guy and you're like, I know you care about Bob Marley and the Wailers. You got to get this done. So what's going on in your mind? Like, how did you decide Max's Kansas City was the place to go to? And then what did you do leading up to that meeting with Max's Kansas City? Like, how did the meeting come about? How did you ultimately secure this moment in time for Bob Marley and the Wailers and yourself?
Well, I was given the privilege of having this job to arrange the first North American dates for the Wailers. So, of course, we needed New York, and nobody knew who we were. And Max's, I knew about Max's because in the 60s when it started as a bar and a restaurant. The owner, Mickey Ruskin, would trade food and a tab for art. Center for the art world in the mid and late 60s. All the most cutting edge artists would be there.
How do you get in there?
You just knock on the door. I mean, I knew who the guy was who did the bookings. His name was Sam Hood.
So you just walk up to Max's Kansas City down, what was it in Park in the 20s or so, and you're just going to go to the front door and knock and be like, I got this new Rastafarian, soon to be the most iconic, legendary singer, musician on the planet, and I'm going to try to convince you to book him?
Yeah. I mean, I just knock on I went in the afternoon. They're setting up for the evening for dinner and whatever group was going to be upstairs. And I just knock on the door.
So what's going on in your head though? Like, this is an important thing for you, right? Like, you need to get this gig for Bob.
Well, I needed to get a gig in New York. And that seemed like the best place to start because they booked unknown acts. So I knew I had a shot. And it was a place where journalists would go, artists, journalists, writers, musicians. It was it was like a hip place.
Did you go in with a tape? Did you bring some of his music with you?
Well, I had the album, the Catch a Fire album, which opened like a Zippo cigarette lighter. And it was called Catch a Fire. So I walked in with the album, and I knocked on the door. It was, there was windows. There was big windows you could see in, and somebody let me in. I said I want to see Sam Hood, and so cool. They said he's upstairs. And I walked upstairs. He had a little tiny office with the turntable. And I said, I want you to hear this. And he said, okay. And I opened the thing up. I thought, wow, it's so cool. It opens like a Zippo lighter. And I handed it to him. He put it on the turntable. The first song was Concrete Jungle. No sun will shine in my day-to-day. The hot yellow moon won't come out to play in this here concrete jungle where the living is hardest. And he got through the first verse and picked up the needle and went to the second cut, which was Slave Driver. The tables are turned. He listened to half of the first verse, picked up the needle, went to the next song. It was 400 years. He listened to about 10 seconds of it. And I thought, well, it didn't work, but I tried. And he looked at me and he said, I get this. This is the Drifters with raised consciousness. I'll put you guys on. And
The Drifters.
The Drifters, yeah, which was, the Drifters were, that was something that the Wailers listened to.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the Drifters were, definitely influential.
So you lock in Max's, but I got to ask you a question before we talk about Max's specifically. So the album name, Catch a Fire, isn't there like a double meaning to that? Is Catch a Fire, like I read that it's like, there's like a different meaning to it in Jamaica. There's a slang connected to that. Am I correct?
A lot of Rasta cooking was on an open fire, like outside, and there'd be some wood, and you light the wood, and there's a pot, and you have to catch a fire. And then there's also catch a fire for burning a spliff or burning a chalice. You have to catch a fire. So it had all these connotations. And we were trying to catch a fire with the music.
You lit it up at Max's. So the guy gives you the green light, and then much to your surprise, he tells you that Bob Marley and the Wailers are opening for.
Yeah, he didn't tell me who we were going to open for until later. He told me the dates he could give me. And then later, when I checked in with him, he told me we were opening for this other act, which was a brand new act. And it was Bruce Springsteen, but there was a tremendous amount of hype for Bruce. He signed the biggest record contract for a new artist, and it was Columbia Records. And the hype was that this was the new Bob Dylan, which, was getting some pushback. I mean, how could there be a new Bob Dylan? But, it was exciting because it meant that, for our purposes, we wanted attention. We wanted media attention because radio wasn't going to play us. Well, we needed the media attention. That was the purpose of getting out there. And this was really great because everyone had to see this new act, Bruce Springsteen. Everyone in the media. And Columbia was pushing it, and they were going to get everyone there who could possibly write about it or talk about it, about Bruce. And I remember the first night, there was the place only held like 100 people, maybe not even. And I remember the first night, there was like 10 people there for us. And then the second night, it was like half full for us. And then by the third night, it was packed. There was like a real buzz about the Wailers. This new, not only was it a new group, but it was music that people didn't know about. It was a new genre of music, and it was very social, political, and I think it was a really good look for Bruce to have the Wailers. This new, it was. I think it added something, to the whole Bruce avalanche that was beginning.
Yeah, I heard actually that like years later when Bob played at the Garden with I think what was it, like Lionel Richie and the Commodores, it had a similar impact where like he was opening for the Commodores at the Garden, and the big attraction was actually Bob, and a lot of the people that came to see the
Wait,
concert.
hold on. That's true. But as far as the Bruce dates,
Yeah.
It wasn't like we overshadowed Bruce.
Okay.
Bruce was fantastic. Bruce was living up to the hype. I think we added a kind of flavor and hipness, extra hipness, to Bruce's coming out now.
Lee, what was the room like on that third night where you said it was like finally crowded, a lot of people there? Like, paint the picture, because it's so different from what we experience these days in like a restaurant or even a nightclub. Like, who was there? What kind of celebrities? What kind of vibe? Is there smoke in the room? Are people smoking weed all over the place? Like, what was the room like? What was the ambiance?
People were smoking weed there, but yeah, I mean, it was smoky. In those days, you could smoke in restaurants and bars. And it was packed. It had the feeling that this was like an important cultural event. This Jamaican group and the new Bob Dylan. It was exciting. It was amazing, really. It accomplished everything that I hoped we could accomplish for the first North American dates for this Jamaican cultural, really important group.
You recited the lyrics to Concrete Jungle, which is great. No sun will shine in my day to day. The high yellow moon won't come out to play in this here concrete jungle. Where living is the hardest. Do you see any parallels between, like when we talk about those lyrics, concrete jungle, are there parallels between your growth, your development and growth in the Bronx, Jewish household, communist principles, and Bob's growth and early childhood development in Jamaica?
Well, a couple of things. When I was like 8 years old, my mother made me take music lessons. And on Saturday mornings, when I wanted to be playing ball with my friends, and I'd have to take the subway down to this music school, which was on 74th Street, Central Park West. It was called the Metropolitan Music School. And my family were communists at a time, in the 50s when there was McCarthy, the Rosenberg trial, and my family knew these people, and they were sympathetic. And this music school that I went to, and my first music teacher was a guy named Fred Hellerman. And Fred Hellerman was in a group that in 1950 had a #1 pop music hit with a Lead Belly song called Goodnight Irene. And the lead singer was a guy named Pete Seeger. And when the McCarthy hearings started, the Weavers were blacklisted. So no one would book them for shows. And Fred Hellerman, who was one of the four weavers, to pay the rent, he was teaching guitar at this music school, the Metropolitan School of Music. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I was taking lessons from this incredible guy. Later on, he went on to produce this iconic album with Arlo Guthrie, Woody Guthrie's son, called Alice's Restaurant.
Wow.
So
Incredible.
This was it was a great advantage that my parents pushed me into reluctantly. At that time, we were living in this tiny 3-room tenement building, 5 stories, no elevator. And the building next to us was being torn down to build the Cross Bronx Expressway.
Wow.
That to this day continues to decimate the Bronx, because it went through all these homogeneous, multi-ethnic neighborhoods and destroyed them. And right at that time, they were building the Sedgwick projects around the corner from where we lived. And when I moved to Jamaica in 1973, several years later, a Jamaican immigrant living in those Sedgwick projects, a guy named Kool Herc, invented hip hop.
Yeah.
So that was the kind of neighborhood I grew up in.
Did you know Kool Herc?
No, but he got the idea for hip hop from rap.
Yeah.
From Jamaicans. Because the Jamaican music, when I arrived in Jamaica in 1973, the top 20 records, probably 16 of them were somebody talking over a rhythm track. So it had kind of taken over Jamaican music. And Kool Herc changed the rhythm, the reggae rhythms, into R&B influenced rhythms, and then started talking over them. And that's how the Jamaican influence in the beginning of hip hop.
So Lee, it's kind of interesting. Like you go from like the concrete jungle of the Bronx, they're building, they're like shredding basically the Bronx, the neighborhood. It's like it goes through the entire neighborhood. It's even till today. It's got to be so annoying. The noise that must have been happening as they built this roadway.
Cranes with these giant steel balls smashing into the building, and then the sound of the bulldozers and jackhammers creating this enormous trench
for years. I bet
thousands of year old granite. Connecting the George Washington Bridge and decimating all these neighborhoods in the Bronx. So that was part of the soundtrack of me growing up. So I could relate to the concrete jungle. But what was fantastic when I first heard that song and those lyrics is because it smashed the idea of the smiling, happy native singing to tourists on this idyllic island. It just totally deconstructed that idea. And then all of a sudden, this paradise island was a concrete jungle. And this is the concept of it. And then to be the first song on the Wailers' first international album, and to have that lyric, it was really powerful. It was something that I related to, not just intellectually, but viscerally. I just thought this was just the most incredible thing. And when I, started to Bob was like, he was so charismatic and so fun to be around. You just wanted to be around him. And I felt like he was doing something. It was a time in 1973. They're overthrowing the government in Chile. There's a fascist government, a military government in Brazil. There's the Vietnam War is still raging. And here's this voice from the so-called third world that was just cutting through all the neo-colonialist theory and all the theory of race. And when you saw Bob, he was neither black nor white, and he was both. So I thought, wow, this has a really, really fantastic opportunity to make a really important cultural shift in the world. And looking back 50 years, it's hard to imagine the world without the Wailers' music.
I know that you have a tremendous amount of love and passion for Bob Marley and his family, but it seems like you have like an equal amount of love and passion for Jamaica, for the island, for the land. Is there something about the land, about that island, that attracted creatives in particular to come to the island?
Well, Jamaica's, it's only 150 miles long and 50 miles wide. But at the same time, there's 7,000-foot mountains that run through the middle. So it becomes a huge place that you can't explore all of Jamaica in a lifetime if that's all you did. Because through the mountains, there's all these tiny roads, and you can't drive very fast. And you'll never in a lifetime be able to find all of Jamaica. So it's tiny, but it's huge. And what's really so special about it is the ethnic makeup, because it started with the indigenous people, the Arawaks, Tainos, Caribs, and first the Spanish came, and some mixed with the indigenous people, and they also very much obliterated that culture. And then the English came. And then the English brought the Africans because they saw, well, we can make sugar for tea. They wanted the sugar, but they didn't want to work to cut down the cane in the tropical heat. So they kidnapped people from West Africa and brought them. And then the English didn't want to oversee the people, the slaves. So they brought Irish. And they also brought young Irish girls and kind of slaves. and kind of sexual kind of slavery.
Like a sex trafficking kind of thing?
Yeah, it's the time of Cromwell when the English took over Ireland and tried to obliterate the Irish culture, outlawed the Gaelic language. So then you had Irish, you had Africans, you had English, you had some residue, some people left over mixed from Spanish and indigenous. And then when the English outlawed slavery in, I think it's 1839, they started to bring people from Asia. It was another kind of slavery. They called it indentured servants. So what they would do is they would offer people from India and from China passage to Jamaica. They put them to work, and they would have to work a certain amount of years, 5 years, 10 years, to pay off the trip. So it was kind of like
Indentured servitude.
yeah, so it was another kind of slavery.
Sure.
But it would end in like 5 years or 10 years, whatever. So those people, so now you had Indians, real Indians, I mean, Indians from India. And now you had Chinese mixing with the English, the Irish, the Spanish, the Arawaks. So Jamaica is this ethnic mix. Hundreds of years of these people mixing. So it's this microcosm of the world in this tiny, huge island.
Amazing.
And it's still exciting to go to because so much of Jamaica, because of the mountains and because takes so much time to explore, so much of Jamaica is still pristine and beautiful.
One of the coolest stories about you and Bob Marley is when you played at Central Park in front of 15,000 people during the summer of 1975. I think you returned home and played this incredible moment in time. But as far as like the photographer piece of you goes, like what inspired you to bring that camera into such a big part of your personality, such a big part of your creative expression, your creative output? Like, what was the impetus behind becoming a photographer?
Well, when I was in college, I had a good, I was studying art history and art, and I had a really good, I took a photography course and had a good teacher, and photography just became part of my art practice. I was making sculpture, and then leaving college, it was the time of conceptual art, and I was involved in that with the artists that were making conceptual art, like Vito Acconci and Dennis Oppenheim, and the concept, one of the main concepts of conceptual art was to be anti-object and not make objects. So the art became something that was recorded with photographs, or at that time was the beginning of making videos. Photography's always been a thread that's run through my art practice. Even later, when I started to make paintings in the 80s, most of the work, most of the paintings were based on photographs, either photographs that I found or photographs that I made. So, yeah, it runs through my work. So it made sense to have a camera with me.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Like you talk about this transition from still photography into video, and now I feel like for the past 5-10 years we're transitioning again. Like with the advent of new technology, phone, cameras in iPhones and social media. It seems like we're going through another transition. I'm curious from your perspective, do you think the advent of technology as it relates to everyone having a camera on them at all times and being able to post on social media has created some kind of a negative impact on the art form of photography?
Well, it's a scary time. I remember when, it's not that long ago, 25 years, when broadband came in, and there was so much optimism that the internet was going to create these possibilities of distributing information, and that was going to be some fantastic positive effect on the world. And now we find that, okay, yes, that's true, but we also find that it's distributing all these falsehoods and contributing to this rise of fascism, which we see so prominently in the United States with this whole MAGA movement and all these people supporting this new, basically this guy who's, implementing this fascist, trying to implement this fascist regime. And this is happening right now in real time. And there's going to be this election in just a few weeks. And we don't know what's going to happen. Half the people believe all these lies that are distributed. So it's scary. And of course, in my own art practice and using photography, I'm very aware of the how ubiquitous the photograph has come, largely in part due to the very high quality of the images that can be captured on phones. So in my photography practice, I'm always extremely aware of that. And I kind of see it as a parallel moment when photography in the 19th century was beginning to disrupt the idea of painting. Because now you had the photograph, you got the reality. So what were artists going to paint? And I looked to Manet, and I looked to a painting like The Woman Behind the Bar, and how he changed the perspective. And so he moved painting to a space that avoided the redundancy of making something that now might look like a photograph. And in my photography practice, I play on the ubiquitousness, on the very high quality photographs that everyone makes with their phones. So I have to move aside from that, as Manet did with painting. I have to do it with my photographs.
That's interesting. And I think with artificial intelligence, that concept that you're talking about, as far as a particular image or a particular visualization of a concept being ubiquitous, is going to be accelerated with AI. And I think that the creative class, people such as yourself, are going to have to think about other ways to push back with these more traditional mediums, whether it's fine painting or even, classical photography. Now, how do you push back against the machine of AI generated or machine generated artwork?
Yeah, well, for me, when I discovered in the early 2000s digital photography, so that's kind of like a little bit before or right when phones started to have cameras. And I discovered I could have a camera, create a digital image, and return to that image, to that capture, to that photograph. And I could alter the perspective. It's a classical perspective that goes back to the Renaissance. And the Renaissance and race theory and colonialism and religion are all tied together as an apology for the African slave trade and for subjugating people in Asia. So I was able to return to that classical perspective that the camera was capturing, and I found out that I could change it, playing on the veracity of the photographic image, how we believe it. When we see a photograph, we believe it. So that became exciting for me. And I started off, again, Chris Blackwell offered me, he introduced me to Tricky in 2006. And I was a big fan of Tricky's, from Massive Attack and then from his solo albums. And I went on this journey with Tricky through the UK, working with him, helping him to direct a movie, and also taking still photographs. And that began this alteration of these very journalistic type photos and turn them into something closer to painting. But in that project, careful not to go beyond the point where you feel that the photographs and that the reality is being manipulated. So I realized I was able to direct a certain concentration, a certain perception, what I felt were the most significant and crucial content within these images.
That's pretty interesting. So, Lee, you've given me a ton of your time and really opened up with these incredible stories. Before, I just want to ask you one more question and then we'll wrap it up. Every guest that joins me on this show participates in this fun thing where I use the, the name of the show, Some Future Day, to start a sentence. And then I lead my guest to and have my guest finish the sentence. So I'm wondering if you would be open enough to playing this game with me.
Yeah, but if I say dumb things, you have to cut it out.
You're too intellectual for that. But it plays into this concept of the manipulation of imagery and messaging into society. Like, you're inspiring me to start to think back into like think about the strength of images throughout time. Communist and Russian communism, Soviet Union communism, and Chinese communist images of the proletariat.
Oh, I wanted to say one thing about that.
Go ahead.
So, like I mentioned, my family, they were communists. So
Yeah.
my mother told me this much later, decades later, that one of my uncles was being investigated, McCarthy, and he was afraid they were going to, find him, throw him in jail, whatever. He fled to Russia.
Huh.
And he lived for a year in Russia. And when he came back to the U.S., he wasn't a communist anymore. Because you have to realize, like, a lot of these intellectuals in the 50s, a lot of them, the blacklisting in Hollywood, all these writers and directors, a lot of them were Jewish. And in the 50s, we saw Russia, or my family, they saw Russia as helping to defeat Nazism. So it's kind of like this heroic thing that they associated with communism and Marx.
Right.
Right? But in truth, there was Stalin, there was this incredible repression. The Russian communism at that time was a kind of fascism. So there was this disillusionment. He was in Russia for a year and he came back and it was like, no, because there was no internet then. We didn't know. People didn't know.
Right. Right. The unalienable rights ended up being important for that individual, right? For that family member. But here's the point. So like you just went from, it's interesting because I was going to segue from like those iconic proletariat posters and messaging over to, Adolf Hitler's use of imagery, very powerful as it related to film that was broadcasting even into Western households during World War II, not just the posters and the photos, but the video in particular. So the way I want to end this episode with you is this way. So we're seeing these movements, these mechanisms where the power of imagery is transforming culture and having a radical impact on humankind. We've seen that with the proletariat communist posters in the Soviet Union, in China. We saw during Hitler's movement, terrible images coming out that were pushed all over the world. The video images that Hitler used, the photography that he used to, brainwash people to do these horrible things. And I'm wondering, for you, in some future day, will seeing actually be believing?
That's tough. Well, I think seeing is believing. I don't think we've totally gone past that. Looking the Rodney King incident being, videotaped, the George Floyd, people believe that. So we haven't completely gone past seeing as believing. Of course, we're in the age of manipulating, and things that aren't can appear like they are. And that's creates a whole other set of problems that we're living with.
Lee Jaffe, it's really been such a pleasure speaking with you. I enjoyed our range of topics, from intellect and philosophy to geography and fine art to legends like Bob Marley. Thank you so much for joining me on Some Future Day today, Lee. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I know your time is very important, so thank you so much for joining me today. For ongoing insight surrounding these important topics, you can join the conversation on my social media channels, including Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Marc Beckman. And to sign up for my newsletter on Substack, you can find me at marcbeckman.substack.com. To make sure you don't miss a show, be sure to subscribe to Some Future Day across all major platforms worldwide, including YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. Special thanks to New York University for producing Some Future Day, and a big shout out to my producer extraordinaire, John Boomhofer, for being patient and always encouraging me to push through. Thanks a lot, John. Have a great day.